So just a little bit of background about myself. I grew up in India. I did my undergraduate work in biomedical engineering, came to the University of Texas at Austin, and then did my master's degree in biomedical engineering. Subsequently went to the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my PhD in bioengineering, and was fortunate to get a faculty position in biomedical engineering at Rutgers University before getting this great opportunity in Cleveland at Case Western in 2012, which allowed me to move to Cleveland and set up the Center for Computational Imaging and Personalized Diagnostics. So the reason I started with that was because I've always been a biomedical engineer. That's sort of been part of my DNA. I've only trained as a biomedical engineer. But what is interesting about biomedical engineering is that it is a discipline that's really an amalgam of multiple different disciplines. So even though I was majoring in biomedical engineering, I was taking courses in electrical engineering. I was taking courses in computer science and computer engineering, while at the same time learning about physiology, learning about anatomy. And so I think that when I look back, all of my training really set me up in a unique way to take what I'd learned in electrical engineering and computer science, but to target it in a very focused way to address problems in the biomedical realm. And the other thing that I think my biomedical training did for me was really ground me in thinking deeply about the translational problems, thinking about problems less from an algorithmic computational perspective and thinking for most about what the unmet clinical need was, what the unmet biomedical challenges were. And so I think my training really instilled in me the need to think translationally. And because of that, I was constantly thinking about how one could leverage computational sciences and addressing unmet clinical problems, biomedical problems with the computational techniques. So when I was training during my PhD in bioengineering at the University of Pennsylvania, I had the good fortune of meeting a couple of pathologists, Mike Feldman and John Tomaszewski, who were at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was then that I was really exposed to both digital pathology as well as radiographic images, and started to appreciate and understand the tremendous opportunities of artificial intelligence and computer science, and using those approaches to really unravel subtle patterns in these images, patterns that even my collaborating pathologists would struggle to really identify visually, right? And so it was then I started to appreciate the power of computational imaging to unearth and unravel these subvisual patterns. And in close dialogue and collaboration with them, started to appreciate the opportunities to take these subvisual patterns and apply it not just in the context of disease diagnosis, which clearly is important, but really thinking about prognostics and thinking about the predictive aspects. So even though today a lot of the buzz around AI is for disease diagnosis, because of my collaborations with clinicians at an early stage, started to appreciate the huge sort of world or universe of unmet clinical need post-diagnosis. What we forget to appreciate fully is that 40%, we take oncology as an example, 40% of the adult population in the United States will be diagnosed with some form of cancer in their lifetime. And so, yes, diagnosis is very important. It's clearly that's been the mainstay of AI applications right now. But more and more, we have to think about how do we manage the treatment strategies for these patients who are being identified or diagnosed with diseases like cancer. There's so many of them. And so I really started at a fairly early stage because of these discussions with clinicians to think about how could we leverage AI and computational imaging to go beyond disease diagnosis, to try to really address questions on how patients with a given disease were going to do 5 years out. What were the implications for a particular therapy? Would they respond to a particular therapy? Did they need a specific therapy such as chemotherapy? One of the things I didn't appreciate at that time was that not all cancers were equal, right? It was only in the conversations with my clinical colleagues I started to appreciate that there were more aggressive breast cancers and less aggressive breast cancers. I'd lost my dear aunt back in India to a very aggressive form of breast cancer. And so it was a real realization for me that my aunt had died because of more aggressive phenotype of the breast cancer, but the majority of early stage breast cancers are actually fairly non-lethal and actually can be managed successfully. And so that then raised the question, should we be treating all these early stage breast cancers aggressively? Can we avoid chemotherapy in a lot of these breast cancer patients? And so I think around 10 to 12 years ago, talking with my pathology colleagues, and I also had the good fortune around that time to meet with and befriend Sridhar Nason, a breast oncologist, where it really started to shape my worldview of the kinds of problems that existed in the clinical realm, and started to think about how I could bring my AI computational expertise to try to address some of these unmet clinical problems, real clinical problems that my clinician colleagues were facing on a daily basis, such as, who do we treat with chemotherapy? Can we avoid chemotherapy in some of these patients? And so that's really what I've carried forward, really thinking about the role and the application of AI to address the issue of toxicity in patients. Can we mitigate the need for some of these aggressive therapies in patients? And along with all of that is the issue of financial toxicity. And that's sort of also been something that's very near and dear to me, right? I mean, we've got a real problem of healthcare costs in this country, right? $2.4 trillion. Clearly, a large part of that, or significant part of that, is the fact that we are overdiagnosing and overtreating a number of these diseases where we probably don't need to. We also have drugs that are becoming extremely expensive, where the therapeutic efficacy is maybe 20%. So we really need to think about how can we address this issue of really expensive therapies that only work 20% of the time, but then 80% of the time when they don't work, we're left with this humongous cost of therapies that are not effective. And so over the last, I'd say 5 to 6 years, we've really started to think deeply about how can AI be used in a way to try to address this issue of financial toxicity. Can we identify, both from a patient-centric perspective, because clearly we want to give the patient the therapy that works, but we also want to reduce unnecessary healthcare costs. So how can we use AI with CT scans, with MRI scans, with biopsy images to try to figure out whether a particular therapy is going to work or not? So sort of in a nutshell, some of the motivation, the backdrop of the kinds of things that we're doing and the kinds of things that we think are really critical unmet needs where AI can have a significant impact.
Sure. And in the current landscape, many pathologists are looking at hundreds of scans.
Yep.
And there's some subjectivity there between what one pathologist may consider aggressive versus another.
Yep.
But perhaps with AI tools, there could be a more objective measure for what really is aggressive.
It's exactly right. So it's interesting. I mean, it goes back to my journey and my evolution, if you will, as a biomedical engineer, as a biomedical AI scientist, if you will. For the initial phase of my foray into computational imaging and AI into the pathology realm or the radiology realm, I was really focused on developing better tools to help in grading of disease. So in other words, pathologists look at these cancers and try to figure out whether it's high grade or it's low grade. And so grade is a very subjective term. Essentially what it means is that pathologists are looking at patterns of the disease and now making a call as to whether there are patterns that look really bad or perhaps not so bad. But as you correctly pointed out, these are qualitative, these are subjective. And because of that subjectivity, there is a great deal of inter-reader, inter-observer variability across pathologist A and pathologist B. The diagnoses can be quite different. And because of that subjectivity, we started to develop algorithms to help reduce that subjectivity. But then quickly came to the realization that while developing tools to help in better stratification of grade was important, what was even more important was the patient, right? At the end of the day, It's really about the disease. It's about the patient. It's about, is this the kind of disease where you're going to be likely to have a recurrence of the disease within 5 years? Are you going to have metastasis on account of this disease within 5 to 10 years? And so I started to appreciate a few years later on that really the grading problem and trying to develop better tools to aid the pathologist in doing the grading was almost sort of the chicken and the egg, because you're developing these tools to help reduce the inter-observed variability. But then what's your ground truth? How do you validate this? Well, you use it against human grade, and that itself is subjective and variable. So it becomes this really cyclical, infinite loop you get stuck in. And so that's when I realized that really what the focus needs to be on is on disease outcome, on patient survival, on really figuring out how these patients are going to do. And more critically, can we use the AI and the pathology to figure out what your response to therapy is going to be like, right? Because that really gets away from subjective things like grade, right? I mean, this is really what is critical. This is really what is more impactful. And so, like I said, over the last 5 to 6 years, that's really been where our focus is. So more than recapitulating human interpretations, how do we really focus on the clinically relevant problems about prognosis and predicting therapeutic response? So that's really where we've been focusing our attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember in one of your lectures that I watched, you mentioned that an image kind of like the one on the computer screen behind you could be as many as 40,000 pixels by 40,000 pixels
that's right.
that
that's
you're
right.
getting. You're able to see with whole slide scans data that perhaps, again, not available to the naked eye.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so the beauty is that what you're seeing here on the screen is a digital image representation of a glass slide. And by digitally scanning this glass slide, you're creating high resolution, very dense data that is perfectly amenable to computational interrogation. I mean, the term I like to use is a digital biomarker or digital stain, because now with the computer we can start to interrogate these images and generate high resolution, high dimensional features and descriptions in a quantitative way that describe the morphology of the disease in a way that no pathologist could do, because that would literally require just hundreds of hours for a pathologist to come anywhere close to what the computer is able to go and interrogate. Now, I hasten to add that the computer, in all of this, I don't want to trivialize the contribution of the pathologist or the radiologist. I think they are, what you've got there is significant brain trust, significant expertise gained over years of training, years of experience, where they have been able to accrue knowledge of multiple different types of presentations, multiple different types of disease phenotypes that they've seen. And so while the AI is very compelling in certain ways, that it can characterize and quantify certain attributes that is difficult for a human being to do, the human reader, the trained expert human reader, also brings significant expertise and significant value. And so one of the things that we've really tried to address is, how can we synergistically get the AI and the human readers? How do we leverage the best of both worlds? How do we leverage the computational efficiency and the ability of the algorithms to go and interrogate subtle features that can be converted into quantitative numbers, but at the same time also start to invoke the higher level, more qualitative expertise that an expert reader brings to the table. And I really think that it's the synergistic combination of the AI and the human readers where the sweet spot is. I think that's really where we're going to see the real bang for the buck. And that's one of the things that we've been striving towards, really trying to see how can we leverage the things that pathologists have identified and discovered over time, and how can we use an AI to convert those qualitative descriptions into quantitative measurements, and so really leverage the best of both worlds, right? And I think that's really where the value is.
And as you strive towards that type of synergy, what are some of the things you hope to see happen, that you hope to see happen within your career in this field? What are the things that you are moving towards?
So as I said, one of the big things for me as a biomedical engineer is the importance of translational science and translational research. I mean, that's very much part of my DNA. I was deliberate in a career path that was in biomedical engineering as opposed to computer science. Nothing wrong with computer science, but it was just that my phenotype, I was really focused on addressing unmet clinical biomedical problems. And for me, I felt that a training that allowed me to really develop the technical skills, but then really be able to focus it on the biomedical problems and get the biomedical training was critical. Why I mention that, why I talk about that is because that's success for me. Success for me is not the papers, not the awards, not the patents. It's ultimately about translation of these technologies into the clinic. It's about actually having impact on healthcare. It's about identifying those patients who could avoid chemotherapy. It's about identifying those patients who are not going to respond to radiation therapy, to immunotherapy, and therefore suggesting a different course of action for those patients. So in my mind, what I hope to accomplish is really the translation of some of these discoveries in the lab, some of these breakthroughs into tangible devices or tangible products that start to impact patient care and patient health. And so we've been making progress. We worked with companies to help us facilitate that transition, but we've also been very mindful of the fact that things like cancers, cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, eye disease, these are not specific to a particular country, right? And one could almost argue that the impact is felt even more in low and middle income countries. And so there is a significant global impact to a lot of things that we're working on. And so with that in mind, we've made a very earnest effort to think about how to translate and apply these technologies in a global context. And so towards that end, last year we were very fortunate to receive a grant from the US Indo Endowment, which allows us to validate our breast cancer diagnostics technology, really looking at biopsy images to figure out which breast cancer patients could avoid chemotherapy in women with breast cancer in India at the Tata Cancer Center. And so, that I'm very proud of. That is something that I see as having a huge impact because some of the tests that exist to help aid in that diagnosis of whether you need chemotherapy or not are just beyond the financial reach of most of the patients in the developing world, in India. And so the technologies we're developing, because they don't destroy tissue, because they're based of AI of an image of a slide, they're potentially very low cost, and so could really have significant impact in that global context. And so for me, success is going to be translation of these technologies, but really, if I could have an impact, in a global context in the developing world, I think that would be, to me, that would be really the, success, right? And so that's something that I'm striving towards.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about Cleveland, and you mentioned you came here in 2012.
Yeah.
Maybe can you describe the advantages to doing this work here in Cleveland with its unique medical ecosystem?
Yeah. Now, I came here in 2012. I have to admit, I had spent a lot of time on the East Coast. I did my training in Philadelphia, was on the faculty in New Jersey. My wife similarly trained in Philadelphia, was working in New York City. So it was a big change. We didn't know much about Cleveland when the opportunity came up. But we came out, we looked at the place, we liked it. But both of us had our reservations. My wife came from a financial background. I was in the biomedical space. And I wasn't sure how it was going to pan out. I talked to my group and said, well, there's an opportunity. And there's no pressure here, but I think that this could be really great for us. And would you like to move? And I asked 12 folks. Every one of them agreed. And so we moved. So there were 13 of us. I call it my dirty dozen that I moved along with. It was very privileged, very honored to have them move with me. And what is really interesting is that of that original 12, I still have 2 or 3 folks who've stayed on, right? Even after 7 years, having completed their training, they've still chosen to stay on. But I was not prepared for what a wonderful ecosystem Cleveland had to offer. And I'm speaking about this firstly from a professional perspective. I knew that for what I needed to do for the artificial intelligence, I needed a few critical ingredients and few critical components. I backed myself to do the science. I backed myself and my team to do the science and do the innovations. What I, however, depended on was having an ecosystem that was accepting and that was willing to work with me and collaborate with me. And I also needed access to data sets because that's the gas that keeps the AI engine running, right?
Sure.
And I've just been blown away with what a wonderful ecosystem we have here in Cleveland. And if anything, my frustration has just been that we are not shouting this out from the rooftops and letting people know that, from an AI in medicine perspective, this is the place to be, right? I mean, Cleveland is really the place to be because we don't have some of the barriers that you might find in other areas. There's a very collaborative milieu here with top draw medical enterprises right here in our backyard between the Cleveland Clinic, university hospitals, Metro, and the third largest VA in the country. We have an unparalleled medical enterprise to really have really impactful AI innovations and applications more critically. The entire ecosystem has been extremely excited about the kind of things that we're doing. In fact, when I tell my colleagues from other parts of the country that it's not uncommon for me to find that the chair of thoracic surgery is waiting outside to talk to me. It's something that really falls outside their mental compass because they can't imagine that you would have MDs and clinicians really walking up to biomedical engineering and having conversations in the biomedical engineering building rather than the other way around where the biomedical engineers are going to the hospitals and to the clinics. And that's not to say that that doesn't happen. But it is such a wonderful ecosystem where you don't have to, I think it's culturally, I think it's very different from a lot of other parts of the country, where people appreciate that there is an opportunity, and you're really focused on moving the needle forward. You're really focused on how can we bring together exciting technology to address unmet clinical needs. One of the things that I had some reservations about before coming was, you've got all of these different partners in this medical enterprise who are competing for the same clinical population or competing clinically. How is it going to be to work with these different partners? And one of the amazing things is that I've actually had almost no issues, no problems in working across the different partners in the medical enterprise. I work with folks at the Cleveland Clinic, I work with folks at the university hospitals, at Metro, and now I'm also part of the VA. I'm also a part-time federal employee. I'm also a research health scientist at the Louis Stokes Cleveland VA. So I've managed to now have a footprint in really all the various different nodes within our medical enterprise. But what is also exciting is that these collaborations span the different nodes within the medical enterprise. So we have lung cancer screening projects, which involve collaborators at the VA, folks at university hospitals, folks at Cleveland Clinic. And my students have very, very unique PhD thesis committees. Their thesis committee is comprised of biomedical engineers, pathologists, radiologists, surgeons, clinicians. And so that is just a very, very unique ecosystem that we have here. And I think also it's just a much friendlier place. I think it's just easier to get things done. One of the things that I joke about with Stan Gerson, our case comprehensive cancer center director, is I can text him and get a response very often in minutes, which is just unfathomable in other parts of the country, right? To have that kind of direct line of conversation. And so I think, I'm the poster child for, why Cleveland represents such a unique opportunity, particularly, in the AI space, in the medical health innovation space. Like I said, my only frustration is that, more people don't know about this. And so my hope, my vision is that, given the unique ecosystem we have here, the unique talents we have here, the clinical expertise, I would imagine that we probably have more physicians per square foot in Cleveland than maybe any other place in the country. I think that we have an opportunity to build something big around AI in medicine, in the city, and really make Cleveland possibly the mecca, if you will, for AI in medicine.
Was there anything else that I didn't ask that you wanted to talk about?
Well, I think that just to go back to the point, I think that I want to thank cleveland.com for this honor, for this award. But I'd also like to say that I think that this is really a recognition, certainly not of just my work, but I want to acknowledge that it's really a reflection of our team. We, like I mentioned, came here with 12 people back in 2012. That team has now grown to something like 60 people, of students, of faculty, of postdocs. And Cleveland and Case has really provided an ecosystem that has allowed us to thrive. It has allowed us to innovate in this space, and within the group we have something like north of 40 different projects, research projects going on in various aspects of artificial intelligence in medicine. In many ways I'm simply the conductor of an orchestra, of a symphony, and I just have really good folks who are part of that orchestra. But I also have all the critical ingredients for the ecosystem that has made a lot of this innovation possible. Just want to maybe also touch on the fact that we've also been punching out a lot of exciting technologies, and slowly but surely we're getting the recognition of the value of what we're doing. In 2018, Prevention magazine called out one of our technologies in using smart imaging computers to identify cancer patients who could avoid chemotherapy as one of the top 10 medical breakthroughs of 2018. In 2019, the journal Nature actually called us out as one of the top 5 groups really doing truly offbeat, innovative research in cancer. So I think that slowly but surely our efforts, our combined efforts, our joint efforts, and I include not just our students, our postdocs, our faculty, our scientists, but also our clinical collaborators. Slowly but surely, all the work over the last 7 years is starting to get the visibility that I think it deserves. And I think even at a citywide level, I think there's an appreciation that we've got something special here. Cleveland could be really not just a medical destination for procedures, but it could really be a destination for all things AI in medicine. And so I think part of this is really getting the word out, getting the visibility so that we have an opportunity to really grow the space. I feel in a lot of ways we're just scratching the surface. This is still nascent as an area, but I think that in some ways we have a competitive advantage, we have a competitive edge, because all the ingredients are here, right? The ingredients are here. But I think that this is carpe diem time, right? I think this is the time when we've got to seize the opportunity, really invest in this space, and institutionally, as a city, we need to think of this potentially as one of the strategic areas that we really want to focus on and move the needle forward. And I think there's an appreciation across the different business development entities, the research entities, the medical entities around town, that this really could be that area where we distinguish ourselves. This could really be that sort of unique selling point for Cleveland. And so I'm very glad that this has all sort of happened to coincide, that this surge of interest is coinciding with our own activities while here in Cleveland. So I'm just very excited. I'm very excited, very hopeful for the future. I think that this is when I look back 7 years ago with the trepidations I initially had, not knowing much about Cleveland, I'm very glad to have made that move, to have made that leap of faith to some extent. And it's really paid off very, very nicely. But I think we're still in some ways, like I said, scratching the surface. I think there's just so many different opportunities. And so we need to keep the momentum going. I think that we need to invest in this area. We need to really own this area, and really, continue to sort of, lead the way, in this space, and get the word out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The only last question I can think of would be, and I'm sure you get this from many people who, when you talk to them about what you do, perhaps they think about cancer and they ask you, how close are we? How close are we to really moving that needle forward to significantly reducing deaths? Yeah.
I think we're getting close. I think that some of these things, we're already in the process of moving a lot of these things into clinical trials. We continue to work with the FDA on the regulatory strategies. The beauty for a lot of the technologies that we're working on is that because they are non-destructive, because they can be validated based on retrospectively acquired data, the turnaround time for the translation of these technologies actually is not in terms of years, but really I think in terms of months, right? So you have the opportunity for some of these technologies in a 24 to 36 month time frame to actually get out there. There continue to be some questions. Reimbursement is clearly a question. How are you going to reimburse for these technologies? So those things have to be figured out. But certainly from a technology standpoint, from getting regulatory approval, my hope is that at least for some of the things that we're doing here at CASE, we're possibly with some of these things in about 24 to 36 months away from getting regulatory approval for some of these technologies. But like I said, clinical trials are underway for some of these technologies. I mentioned the work that we're doing in India with validating our technology in women with breast cancer in India. We have other strategic partners that we're working with in the medical device space, in the pharmaceutical space that we're working with to validate these technologies. So I think that things are aligning. There's a confluence of multiple things that are happening right now, and so my hope is some of these things are going to come to fruition in a relatively short time span, because there's and it's important to understand that there's the potential for real impact in a very short-term time frame. Unlike, say, drug discovery or drug development, we're not talking about a 10-year cycle from conception or ideation to actually getting the drug out. Here we're talking about more, a 2 to 3 year time frame, from the conception or ideation to validation to moving this into regulatory approval. My also hope is that once the pipeline gets set up, once you've got sort of an assembly line, once you figure out how to do this with one of them, then for the other technologies, I think it's possibly becomes somewhat of a cookie cutter template that one is then able to invoke. And so hopefully the momentum and the speed with the approval and the pushing through of these technologies will get potentially quicker. I mean, they all have to be validated. That's super critical. They all have to be validated appropriately and properly. But once you figure out that pipeline, that assembly line of things that have to happen, then from ideation to regulatory approval, you could be down to sort of 18 to 24 months to getting these technologies out and into the clinic. Currently, our group is pushing out, inventions at roughly, one new patent issuance every 6 to 7 weeks. Last year and the year before, our group was 10% of all the issued patents at CASE. So clearly this is an area that there's a lot of excitement around. The institution is clearly investing in this space because they believe in this space. And so there is, an assembly line of patents, that we're somewhere in the order of about 100 patents either issued or pending, based on the work that's coming out of the center. And so, I think that I understand and appreciate that with the patent issuances comes the responsibility of translating that out into the clinic, right? Otherwise, they're just plaques on a wall, right? And so So I'm very aware of that, and so that's certainly something that is very much front and center on my mental radar, that we have to be thinking about translation of these technologies because there's a need. There's a need not just here in Cleveland, there's a need not just here in the US, but really globally, right? And we want to impact health across the world. And so that continues to be sort of the real mantra. Like I said, I mean, it remains, to me, achievement of success is really the translation of these technologies to impacting patient care.